Thank you so much, all of you, for coming today to listen to the world of Beethoven. I was asked to write this series of talks right at the beginning of the year for the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and I was the last talk to be given before everything locked down. And then I finished giving one talk, and then I finished the series about a month or so ago, being the first person to come back to the gallery after it reopened. So and when I wrote these talks, I sort of started my talk not knowing what 2020 was actually going to hold for us all, how this was a very important year because this is the year of Beethoven's 250th birthday, and wanted to say that, you know, the whole world was going to be celebrating this wonderful composer's birth. Obviously, things took a very big turn straight after me giving this first talk. And I did mention when I was giving the talks at the gallery, as I said, a month or so ago, that I think Beethoven would have definitely seen the irony of, in the year of his 250th birthday, that there is a pandemic affecting the whole entire world. And I think he would have seen the irony in that concept. Musicologists often categorize Beethoven's life into three sections. We have the early, the middle, and the late. And it would have been very easy for me, I think, to just sort of give you a plotted history of each of these periods. But instead, what I thought I would do is try and answer some of the questions that always seem to come up when I'm talking about Beethoven. And in doing so, also give you an account of his life and works. The first question that always seems to come up is, how can a composer compose if he can't hear? The second is always about his relationship with the aristocracy and especially Napoleon. And the third is always his legacy. How 250 years after his birth has his popularity continued to soar. And in fact, last year in 2019, Beethoven was voted the most popular composer by the ABC Top 100 composers, outstripping both Bach and Mozart. Beethoven's actual birth date is unknown. But we know that he was baptized on the 17th of December 1770 in Bonn, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and died in Vienna on the 26th of March 1827. Now, his life spans some of the most tumultuous in European history. He was born 20 years before the liberal-minded despotic emperor Joseph II died, and as such was old enough to understand the limited freedoms of life under him, contrasting with the conditions under his brother, who gained control of the throne when Joseph II died. When he was 19, the Bastille was sieged, starting the French Revolution with all of its ramifications. Following that, there was the rise of Napoleon with his liberalizing ideas of freedom, of universal brotherhood, all of which ran true for the young Beethoven, whose childhood had been full of poverty. Then, in 1814, just before Napoleon's final defeat, the monarchs of Europe met in Vienna to somehow restore Europe to its pre-revolutionary glory. And although the common European hoped that the Congress of Vienna would give them some of the freedoms that they had experienced under Napoleon and to a lesser extent Joseph II, this was not the case. Europe was turned into a police state under the watchful eye of Prince Metternich, who suppressed any progressive ideas and reduced the common man's freedom. This was This was Beethoven's world, a world completely different from the one experienced by Mozart or even by Haydn, who died while Napoleon was still conquering Europe. And unlike most composers before him, he was a total political junkie. His musical works, output, and emotional well-being were often reflective of the political situation in Europe at the time. But there was obviously more factors which influenced Beethoven, and his health was definitely one of them. Not only did he go deaf, but he also had terrible stomach problems with ongoing colic and diarrhea, and people now think he may have been celiac. But what about that first question? How can you compose if you can't hear what you're composing? Well, I think there are a few answers. The first is that it's like reading. No one asks you how you can understand what you're reading if you're not speaking the words out loud, you're reading them in your head. And composers do the same thing. They hear the music in their head and then they write it down. And in fact, musicians can do that. When we read a piece of music or a score, we can actually hear that in our head, what we're reading. And Mozart, Schubert, and Berlioz had their music fully formed in their mind. One wrote down on manuscript paper. Also, Beethoven didn't go deaf suddenly. He didn't wake up one morning unable to hear. He first mentions buzzing in his ears when he's about 26, and by 30, he's consulting a doctor about it. So although by the time he's totally deaf, about 16 years later, he couldn't actually hear the performances of his pieces or friends talking, he still had music in his head, although that is obviously lacking to hearing it in the real life. What I think is a more interesting question, though, is how did this inability to hear as a musician and especially as a composer affect Beethoven emotionally, mentally, and socially? By 26, he's living in Vienna, known as the most important musician since Mozart. He'd studied for a short time with the wonderful Haydn and was celebrated as a brilliant virtuosic pianist. Composers at this time were expected to play their music not only as a means of exposing their compositions to the world, but also to gain income from these performances. By the time he was experiencing the first signs of tinnitus, he had composed a couple of piano concertos, his six of his string quartets, and his first symphony, and there was no indication to expect anything but a long and successful career. Then he started noticing buzzing in his ears, and everything was about to change. In 1800, at 30, he wrote from Vienna to a childhood friend who is now a doctor in Bonn, saying, "For the last 3 years, my hearing has grown steadily weaker. I can give you some idea of this particular deafness when I must tell you that in the theatre I have to get very close to the orchestra to understand the performers, and that from a distance I do not hear the high notes of the instruments and the singers' voices. Sometimes too I hardly hear people who speak softly. The sound I can hear, it is true, but not the words. And yet, if anyone shouts, I can't bear it. Beethoven tried to keep this news of his problem a secret from his closest friends, and he feared that his career would be ruined if anyone realized. And it's interesting that the only people he told were his two old friends living in far-off Bonn. For 2 years, I have avoided almost all social gatherings because it is impossible for me to say to people, I am deaf. If I belonged to any other profession, it would be easier. But in my profession, it is a frightful state. There's a story of him going out into the countryside with his right-hand man, the composer Ferdinand Ries, and they see a shepherd in the distance playing a pipe. Now, Beethoven can tell from Ries's face that the music that the shepherd is playing is absolutely beautiful, but he himself can't hear it. And it's said that after this experience, Beethoven was never the same again, because it was the first time that he had to take on full on and firsthand the fact that he was not being able to hear. And at 31, he realized that performing was going to become more and more difficult as his hearing worsened. And so he started dedicating much more time to composition. In October of 1820, at the age of 32, it was recommended by his doctor that he spend some time in Heiligenstadt, which is now part of Vienna, but at this time was our country town, sort of out of the hustle and bustle of Vienna city, close to the Danube and the countryside, where Beethoven loved spending so much time. He spent 6 months there, basically for rest and relaxation, and to try and de-stress after everything that was happening to him about his hearing. It was during this time that he wrote this incredibly important document called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which was locked in a desk and not found till a year after his death. And here are some pictures of the house he was staying in Heiligenstadt. So the Heiligenstadt Testament is an incredibly important document. Not only was it a will to his brothers, but also a confession to them about his ailments and the effects that they were having on him. And he actually mentions suicide. Now, we're going to listen to a little bit of this Heiligenstadt Testament, obviously not spoken in German, but spoken in English, by the wonderful actor John Bell, with the wonderful Australian pianist Tamara Anichevlovska playing the Moonlight Sonata.
For my brothers Carl and Johann Beethoven, to be read and executed after my death. O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. From childhood on, my heart and soul have been full of the tender feeling of goodwill, and I was even inclined to accomplish great things. But think that for 6 years now, I've been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year deceived with hopes of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady whose cure will take years or perhaps be impossible. Though born with a fiery, active temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was soon compelled to isolate myself, to live alone. If at times I tried to forget all this, oh, how harshly was I flung back by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing. Yet it was impossible for me to say, "Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf." Ah, how could I possibly admit to an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others? a sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection, a perfection such as few in my profession enjoy or have ever enjoyed. Oh, I cannot do it. Therefore forgive me when you see me draw back when I would have gladly mingled with you. My misfortune is doubly painful to me because I am bound to be misunderstood. For me, there can be no relaxation with my fellow men, no refined conversations, no mutual exchange of ideas. I must live alone, like one who has been banished. I can mix with society only as much as true necessity demands. If I approach near to people, a hot terror seizes upon me, and I fear being exposed to the danger that my condition might be noticed. Thus it has been during the last 6 months which I have spent in the country. By ordering me to spare my hearing as much as possible, my intelligent doctor almost fell in with my own present frame of mind, though sometimes I ran counter to it by yielding to my desire for companionship. But what a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing, or someone standing next to me heard a shepherd singing and again I heard nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that, and it would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. It seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me. So I endured this wretched existence, truly wretched for so susceptible a body, which can be thrown by a sudden change from the best condition to the very worst. Patience, they say, is what I now must choose to be my guide, and I have done so. I hope my determination will remain firm to endure until it pleases the inexorable Parsi to break the thread.
It's powerful stuff. So, what was the cause of his hearing loss? Well, the exact cause is still unknown. Theories range from syphilis to lead poisoning, typhus, or even possibly the habit of plunging his head into cold water to try and keep himself awake. At times, he also blamed it on his gastrointestinal problems. He said, "The cause of this must be the condition of my belly, which, as you know, has always been wretched and has been getting worse, since I am always troubled with diarrhea, which causes extraordinary weakness." An autopsy, which was carried out obviously after he had died, found that he had an extended inner ear which had developed lesions over time. But as we actually don't have any of its remains, it's impossible to give a precise diagnosis. In the early 1800s, there was little known about hearing, and so the treatments were at times a little bizarre. One was to take lukewarm baths of Danube water, which seemed to help his stomach ailments, but his deafness only became worse. And when I mentioned this once to a German woman, she said there's no way that anyone would get near Danube water. So we can only hope that water from the Danube was a lot fresher in the 1800s than it is today in the 21st century. Another suggestion which he did do was to strap wet bark from a tree around his upper arms until they dried and produced blisters. This didn't cure his hearing at all, but did serve to keep him away from the piano for a couple of weeks as the blisters healed. Beethoven could apparently still hear some speech and music until about 1812. But by the age of 44, he was almost completely deaf, unable to hear voices or so many of the sounds of his beloved's countryside, and this must have been totally devastating for him. After 1822, he gave up seeking treatment for his hearing and tried a range of hearing aids and special hearing trumpets. And here is a drawing of some of the trumpets and hearing devices that he tried. But he also did one other very important thing to try and exclude himself from total isolation. And they were his conversation books, 139 of which still survive and cover the years from about 1818 to when he was 48, until his death at 57. By 1818, he had begun carrying around with him everywhere he went a blank notebook and a pencil, so his acquaintances could jot down their conversations and he could answer them aloud. And these books really offer an incredible insight into the cultural history of the period, as well as into this enigmatic artist. Beethoven's friend Gerhard von Brunning in Bonn says that in his memoirs that Beethoven didn't go anywhere without this little book and pencil, so that his friends, his acquaintances could write their thoughts and ideas, and then Beethoven would then answer what had been written down. A little bit like a one-sided telephone conversation when you're hearing what the person is saying on one end, but you can't actually hear the questions on the other. Here is some pages from these conversation books. I love the coffee stains throughout them, and we can also see that he's writing in a few languages. This page is in German, but we have, and I can't really read that one, but this page here is in French. So we know that he was obviously proficient in many languages. These books, Beethoven jotted down his musical brainstorms as well as other musings. They are chaotic. Some pages talk about food, problems with servants, about illness and attempts of treatment. They also talk about the contemporary cultural and social affairs that are happening in Vienna. Sometimes there are shopping lists, occasional early sketches, topics about music, history, politics, art, literature, theatre, religion, education, and things that were just literally happening in day-to-day Vienna. On one page, you have an invoice for wine, veal, and oysters, and on the other, you have notes about the credo of his mass, the Missus Solemnis. From these books, we get an understanding of who his friends were and who he saw. We know he saw his brother Johann, his nephew Karl, famous contemporaries like the poet Franz Grillparzer, composers like Czerny, Rossini, and the piano wunderkind at the time, Franz Liszt, who was only 11. We know that he was very well read. He discusses authors of antiquity such as Homer, Plutarch, and Plato. He talks about Shakespeare, Rousseau, Goethe, Klopstock, Lessing, and Schiller. We also know that he was involved in a highly political group of friends who met at a local wine tavern. They would discuss politics and especially the consequences of the Congress of Vienna. And at the time, Vienna was suffering under the dictatorship of Prince Metternich, who had really established a police state in Vienna. And it's estimated that 1 in 5 people in Vienna was serving as a spy for Metternich, which is actually a higher percentage than the Stasi in East Germany. Once, when Beethoven wanted to make a critical remark about the regime out loud, he was immediately told to be quiet. The book reads, "Some other time, Hansel the spy is right here, right now." To which Beethoven obviously grabbed the pencil and wrote down in very thick writing, "I am an artist," as if somehow him being this famous composer would potentially stop him from being arrested for making defamatory comments. There are also long sections in the conversation books which concentrate on the composer's work and present Beethoven as a confident writer. In the winter of 1822-1823, when he's about 52, a visitor writes that an artist should look at the spirit of the age, meaning that someone like Beethoven should compose in the same ideas and vein as everybody else at that time. And Beethoven responds by saying he would never do that. Otherwise, all originality would disappear. I cannot shape my works to fit the latest fashion or tailor them according to one's wishes. The new and the original simply present themselves without one pondering them. The world is a king and it wants to be flattered, but true art has a mind of its own, not allowing itself to be forced into flattering forms. And we see this in many of his works. When he was informed that the audience had no understanding of one of his late string quartets, and we think it was probably his string quartet number 13, opus 130, Beethoven makes a curt post on one of the books saying, "They'll like it at some point. I know, I'm an artist." After Beethoven's death, the book somehow landed, we think unlawfully, into the hands of Anton Schindler, who had been the composer's assistant in the last years of his life and was his first biographer. While preparing his biography, Schindler destroyed many of the notebooks. We think there were about 400 originally. He probably destroyed them because there was incriminating information in them, not only about Beethoven, but also probably about friends and associates. But not only did he do that, he also added imaginary talks between Beethoven and others, portraying himself as a staunch confidant. Even back then, contemporaries suspected that Schindler had manipulated the manuscripts, but it was only in the 20th century that investigators were able to unearth the truth about the numerous lies, I suppose, that were in these books. But I suppose the next question has to be whether his deafness changed his music. In her book, The Story of My Life, published in 1900, Helen Keller wrote, The problems of deafness are deeper and more complex, more important than those of blindness. Deafness is a greater misfortune. It represents the loss of the most vital stimulus, the sound of the voice that carries language, moves thinking, and keeps us in the intellectual companionship of mankind. So here we have a woman who is deaf, dumb, and blind, saying that the deafness, her deafness, is the greatest affliction. And although his talent never diminished despite his failing hearing, it did definitely change. It became, as he became more deaf, it became more difficult for him to hear the high frequencies. That means the high notes on the piano, say, the top octaves on the piano. And his compositions seemed to start using more of the lower range of the spectrum of notes, the ones that he could hear more clearly. And we hear this in works including the Moonlight Sonata, which we listened to a little bit earlier, his opera Fidelio, his first 6 symphonies. But by the end of his life, when he could no longer rely on his hearing at all, he once again starts using these high frequencies because he can't hear anything, high or low. We also hear his style change as he starts to retreat from public life. His once vivacious piano sonata starts to take on a darker tone. His famous 6th symphony also reflects this different part of time in his life. This symphony is known as his Pastoral, and the musical work conveys the peace of the countryside where Beethoven would go to escape the hustle and bustle of the city life and try and help with his sanity. But when we know that this symphony was actually written once he had lost all his hearing, and we realize that the beautiful melodies and sounds of the countryside are actually a memory rather than what he could actually hear, this piece of music becomes so much more poignant. One distinct way that his writing did change was with opera. It's often asked, why did he only write one, Fidelio? But think how hard it must have been for someone who can't hear to write an opera. Not the writing per se, but having to deal with all the contacts that are needed to write an opera. Instrumental is easy. Instrumental music is easy, especially if you're someone like Beethoven. It's all about abstract ideas and metaphorical concepts, while opera is about direct revelations, concrete human relationships and situations. Here we have a man who was finding it hard to communicate with friends. How was he going to be able to communicate with the singers, with the conductor, with the instrumentalists, with the stage manager, with the costume designer, the set designer, the impresario, all of these people that you need to have direct relationships with when you write an opera, where he couldn't even have those direct relationships with those closest to him. Before his deafness, it was assumed that he would become the second Mozart, i.e. writing in all forms of music, including opera. But this didn't eventuate. And in fact, there have been many references made to Florenstein in Fidelio being Beethoven, both imprisoned unjustly.
zerstreut sich schon.
He continued to perform publicly until 1811, where he couldn't perform his own Emperor Concerto, and he never performed in public again. The friend and composer Louis Spohr watched Beethoven rehearsing the Archduke Trio in 1814 and said, "In forte passages, the poor deaf man pounded on the keys until the strings jangled, and in piano he played so softly that whole groups of notes were admitted, so that the music was unintelligible unless one could look into the pianoforte part. I was deeply saddened at so hard a fate." what an ensemble. It's amazing. He would continuously wreck pianos by banging on them so hard in order to be able to hear the notes. And he continuously had to change lodgings as landlords complained about him pounding on pianos all day and all night. But artistically, though, isolation did have its benefits. Every morning he woke up at about 5:30 and he would compose for a couple of hours and then have breakfast. And then if the weather was good, he would wander through the meadows, pencil and notebook in hand, lost in thought. And if the weather was bad, he would tramp all around Vienna. He sketched his ideas, he mumbled, he waved his arms, he sang, he stomped. He would forget to eat, he'd forget to sleep. He would sit in restaurants for hours, scribbling music on napkins, menus, and even windows. Sometimes he was so distracted, he would even pay for other people's bills. Now, I couldn't really work out how this was possible until, as I was writing this, I almost ran over somebody who stepped out onto the road wearing AirPods. And it suddenly occurred to me that that is sort of a similar concept when you've got headphones in your head or AirPods in your ears, and you are totally isolated from the rest of the world, and you are in that world of your own. And we've all seen people doing crazy things when they're not sort of part of society. And this is how Beethoven must have been all day and all night. And by 45, his hearing was completely gone. And he really did lose his public life. He gave up performing in public appearances and only allowed a select group of friends to visit him. Deafness had forced him to become very private and an insular person over the course of time. Beethoven had also always spent a great deal of time improvising on the piano, not just for public, but also a way of writing his compositions. We know that his servants said to him at the beginning of his deafness that he would often compose with or play the piano with a pencil in his mouth and the other side of the pencil touching the soundboard of the piano so that he could hear the vibrations of the piano through the pencil. Then in early 1880, he received a fantastic gift. It was a Broadwood piano given to him by the piano builder, the English piano builder, and he treasured this piano for the rest of his life. Now, the Broadwood is constructed differently from most pianos. Most pianos have their soundboard, which isn't attached to the structure or the frame of the piano, but on the Broadwood, it was. So this meant that being able to play this instrument, the vibrations of what he was playing would resonate around the whole structure of the piano, giving him a much better idea of what the sound was, even though he couldn't hear it. Then 2 years later, he added this incredible contraption to his piano, and it's what you can see on the screen now. And no, that's not Beethoven lying in the middle of it. He built this amplifier or this hearing machine onto the piano, which we think was probably made of zinc. It was this concave metal resonator. And he made this and various other versions throughout the rest of his life, which meant that the hearing machine would amplify the sounds and vibrations even further of the instrument. And it meant that playing the piano for him became literally a physical extension of his body. And he could feel those vibrations up through his legs, through his hands, and through his whole body. So this, although he couldn't actually hear the music, he could feel those vibrations, which then in turn, he could translate into sound. Despite the remarkable lengths Beethoven went in order to hear music, by the 1820s, he was composing in total deafness. But he also managed to write some of his greatest works, including his last 5 piano sonatas, his Missa Solemnis, his Symphony No. 9, and his last 5 string quartets. His music possessed a unique style full of suffering and joy, reminiscent of his life. And these works have long been considered among the most challenging and rewarding works of his whole repertoire. Deafness. Beethoven wrote works that displayed a broad range of emotions. We know his thunderous works of this late period, but he also wrote works of incredible beauty. We have the Pastoral Symphony, which we heard before, with its beautiful, relaxed ideas of the countryside. We know his late bagatelles, which are these delightful, impish small piano works, and the beautiful lyrical song cycle, Undefernt geliebt.
Auf dem Hügel sieht sich spähend in das blaue Nebelland nach den fernen Driften sehend, wo ich dich, Geliebte, fand. Weit bin ich von dir geschieden, trennend liegen Berg und Tal zwischen uns und unserem Frieden, unserem Glück und unserer Qual. Den Blick kannst du nicht sehen, der zu dir so glühend treibt, und die Seufzer, sie verwehen in dem Raume, der uns treibt.
Thank you for those people who have written notes. I will get to them when we finish. These pieces were written as his deafness worsened, showing that even under these circumstances, his technique, his emotional range continued to broaden. Beethoven learned to work with his deafness and around it. Even those people who have never heard Beethoven's music know about the composer who went deaf. And Hollywood could not have written a more tragic storyline. The young star, a composer who at the start of his blistering career inconceivably begins to lose his hearing. But what we can see is that even under these circumstances, Beethoven survives and thrives and writes some of the most profound music we have. Who can tell what his career would have been like if deafness hadn't occurred? But I am wondering if the pathos and heartbreaking beauty, the fury and the passion would have been quite so intense. Thank you very much, everybody. I will take you off share so I can see you all. And if anybody has questions, please unmute yourselves and ask them. And I will also have a look at the chats. Thank you. Thank you. There were no questions, just lovely remarks. Thank you so much. But does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Please just unmute yourselves and scream at me.
No questions, but thank you very much. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Thank you. And the next one in 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at Beethoven and his relationship with the aristocrats and with Napoleon. So
I do have a question.
Yes, please.
Joan, where can you access the information that you spoke about?
Oh, well, there's a lot.
Is that accessible?
No. I mean,
okay. So it's your research.
Yes, there I have to say there is months and months and months of research going into all of that.
No, of course I understand that. That's fine. Thank you.
Sorry.
No.
Any other questions?
No. If you say there's months and months of research, that can't be lost. This was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And no problem dragging myself away from a little bit of freedom to listen to that.
Oh, thank you so much. That is so
Yes.
lovely of you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
concur. Thank
Oh.
you.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know, it's Beethoven. It's a great topic. Well, if there are any other questions or anything, if not, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks' time for another look at the wonderful Beethoven. The handout that is attached has all the music that I've just talked about, and also the whole of that Heiligenstadt Testament, if you want to hear the rest of it. Really quite phenomenal to actually hear Beethoven's actual words. Really, it gave to me an incredible insight into this enigmatic man. So, and you can also there is a book of the translation of those conversation books too. It was written out a couple of years ago, so I'm not quite sure how you get it, but there is an English translation of those conversation books too, which is fascinating. So if there are no other questions, just lovely, lovely remarks, which I thank you all very, very much for. Have a wonderful time. You Melbourneites who can go out and get a coffee and see other people. And for us lucky Sydney-siders who have been doing it for a while, and everyone else in Australia, have a wonderful couple of weeks, and I will see you all later. So thank you all very, very much. So see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.